Your third exam paper is a source inquiry looking at a particular protest in the 20th century. Of the 4 protests that we'll be looking at, the first is the Suffragettes. Suffragettes were a group of women who were campaigning for women to gain the right to vote. In fact, the word suffrage actually means, as you can see in point number 1, the right to vote. Before we look at this campaign, we have to look at the role of women at the turn of the 19th century. The typical Victorian middle-class woman was basically a housewife, a mother, and their job was to look after the family and their husband. Most women were financially dependent on their husbands. However, by 1900, many middle-class women were enjoying new opportunities in work. For example, through education, they were becoming doctors, and they could even be teachers. As a result of this, many women were basically saying, if we are paying taxes, then why do we not enjoy the same rights as men do? The poster that I am now enlarging, as you can see, highlights this point. What a woman may be and yet not have the vote, a doctor or a teacher, and what a man may have been and yet not lose the vote, a lunatic or a drunkard. At first, the campaign for women's suffrage used the tactics of persuasion. What happened? The first suffrage groups were set up in the 1860s, and by 1897 they had all joined together to form the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, the NUWSS. Led by Millicent Fawcett, its tactics involved using petitions, making speeches, holding public meetings, lobbying members of Parliament, and trying to use persuasion to gain the right to vote. However, their tactics often led on deaf ears. Their message was being largely ignored. After all, writing a petition to a member of Parliament was hardly going to get you front page on the newspapers. This led to a breakaway movement called the Suffragettes being formed. Now, the Suffragists, their full title was the Women's Social and Political Union, standing for WSPU. Their aim was to get the maximum publicity possible and to make sure that their campaign received front-page headlines on newspapers. Their motto was quite simply, deeds, not words. They believed in direct action, in events that would get them publicity. So what did they do in order to gain publicity? Well, their tactics did change over the years. They began in 1905 by attending meetings in Parliament and basically heckling members of Parliament. In a famous event in 1906, during a meeting in the Houses of Parliament, suffragists were arrested by the police for breaking the peace. As a result of these arrests, 10 were put in prison for sentences from 6 to 2 years. This gained them a lot of publicity and also a lot of sympathy. A change of government in 1908 led to the Liberals coming into power, and the Liberal Prime Minister at the time, Herbert Asquith, said to women that if they were to pass a law giving women the rights to vote, it was down to the suffragettes to prove that they had the support of the general public. As a result, the suffragettes held a meeting in Hyde Park, London, where over 500,000 women attended. The women felt that they had proved their case, that they did have popular support, but still Asquith did nothing. As a result, the suffragettes decided to employ more direct action. For example, they began a campaign of smashing windows. They also chained themselves to the railings of 10 Downing Street, the Prime Minister's residence, an event that would obviously give them lots of publicity in newspapers. In 1908, a peaceful demonstration in Parliament Square, London, turned nasty when heavy-handed tactics were used by 5,000 policemen. Enraged by the police action, 2 teachers threw stones through the window of 10 Downing Street. They were sent to Holloway Prison for 2 months, and on they were released they were greeted as heroines. 27 other women were also sent to Holloway Prison after this event. Whilst in prison, they demanded that they be treated differently to normal prisoners, to ordinary criminals, saying that they should be treated as political prisoners and given certain rights. The authorities refused to do this, to give them these rights, and so the women involved went on a hunger strike. Rather than allow them to die and become martyrs, the prison authorities decided to force-feed them. However, by doing so, it created a lot of bad publicity for the government, as can be seen from this poster. Here you have a suffragette who is being force-fed in prison. A rubber tube is being forced down her nose and down the back of her throat into her lungs, and liquid food is being put into her to prevent her from starving. This poster, used by the suffragettes, gained them a lot of support, and there was a lot of anger towards the government, who were seen as torturing women. As a result of this, the government took the view that it was probably best to release these women rather than see them force-fed and starving and becoming martyrs. The new tactic employed by the government can be shown in the poster here. What they did when the suffragettes went into prison and embarked on a hunger strike, before they starved, the government would release them. Once they were fit enough, the government would then re-arrest them and put them back in prison. Once again, the suffragettes attacked this policy, and it became known as the Cat and Mouse Act. The idea, as you can see from the poster, is the suffragette is being treated like a cat would treat a mouse. Still, the government refused to give women the vote. In fact, many began to argue that the tactics used by the suffragettes were actually losing them the support of the people. Nevertheless, they became increasingly violent. By 1913, there were even arson attacks on public buildings, which you can see from this poster here. Obviously, this newspaper is not sympathetic towards the suffragettes. It calls them wild women. Ascot Racecourse was burned down. There was even a hammer thrown at the Prime Minister at the time. Many golf courses were attacked by women, where they put acid on the greens. Perhaps the most famous event was when a woman suffragette called Emily Davison threw herself in front of the King's horse in the Epsom Derby of 1913. Still, the government did not move, and still the suffragettes were not given the vote. Then, in 1914, the suffragettes suddenly called off their campaign. The reason being, World War I was declared on the 4th of August 1914. When the war was declared, the suffragettes decided that they would help with the war effort, and during the course of the war, many women helped out by working in factories or working in agriculture, growing food, and doing their bit for the war effort. When the war ended in 1918, the government decided to grant women up to the age or over the age of 28 the vote. Many argue as to whether it was the suffragette campaign that led to this, or whether it was the fact that women were being rewarded for their work during World War I. Again, this is an argument that goes on today. Some would argue the government gave women the vote because they didn't want to see a return of the suffragette campaign, and they knew that it would only be a matter of time before they would have to grant them equal rights. So, the suffragette campaign. The big question would be, why did suffragette protests turn more violent, and how effective were the methods used by the campaign for women's suffrage?